There's something strange about money. You might not be spending more than before, not buying anything big, yet somehow the pressure around money feels heavier, not because you're running out of money, but because you're stuck in decisions you made before. What's interesting is most people don't realize their financial pressure doesn't come from the present. It comes from the past, from things you said yes to without realizing they would last. And once you start seeing this, you begin to understand why money always feels like it's not enough, even when everything looks fine on the surface. I've noticed a pattern that shows up in a lot of people. Month after month, nothing dramatic happens. You're still working, still earning, still spending within what feels reasonable, but internally, there's this feeling that's hard to describe. You're not exactly broke, but you're not relaxed either. You start thinking more before spending, not because something is expensive, but because you feel like you're tied down by something you can't clearly see, but it's always there. A simple example, you don't buy anything new, yet you still feel like you can't spend. Not because you don't have money, but because you know there are already many things waiting ahead, things you agreed to earlier, but at the time, they didn't feel heavy at all. Just a small decision, a harmless choice. But when enough of those decisions stack up, they create a very different feeling, a feeling of being locked in. And what's interesting is, most people never look at these things as a system. They look at each expense individually, and because each one seems reasonable, they don't see a problem until everything combined starts to feel heavy. Main idea: financial pressure doesn't come from how much you spend. It comes from how many times you said yes. I've realized something important, but very easy to miss. Money doesn't stress you out when you spend it. It stresses you out afterward, not because of the amount, but because of how many times you said yes. You agreed to pay something monthly. You agreed to maintain a certain lifestyle. You agreed to a new standard for your life. At the time, everything made sense. You didn't feel pressure. You might have even felt like life was improving. But what's interesting is, every time you say yes, you're giving up a little bit of your future flexibility. Not a lot, just a little. But over time, it builds into a system that you now have to maintain. For example, you don't need to spend more to feel pressure. You just need more things you have to pay for. And as those must-pay items increase, your thinking starts to change. You stop thinking, how much money do I have? And start thinking, how much do I have left after everything I've committed to? That's when pressure shows up. Not when you spend, but when you realize you don't have many options left, and a quiet question starts forming in your mind. If something happens, can I handle it? That's not really a question about money. It's a question about flexibility. And most people only realize how much flexibility they've lost after it's already gone. The takeaway: financial pressure doesn't come from how much you spend. It comes from how many choices you've locked yourself into. Main idea 2: you don't feel pressure when the system is still working. You feel it when the system starts to slip. I've noticed something a bit paradoxical. A lot of people can carry a pretty heavy financial system for a long time and still feel like everything is fine. Income is stable, bills are paid, nothing seems wrong, and that it's working feeling creates a very dangerous illusion. The illusion that I've got this under control. But what's interesting is your financial system doesn't need to collapse for you to feel pressure. It just needs to slip slightly. A simple example: 1 month, you spend a little more than usual, not because you're careless. Just a few things came up. A higher bill than expected. An expense you couldn't delay. A small decision. at the wrong time. And suddenly, something shifts inside, not because you can't pay, but because you realize, I don't have as much buffer as I thought. That moment matters because it doesn't come from a big mistake. It comes from a small misalignment, but enough to show you your system isn't as flexible as you believed. Most people don't realize a stable financial system doesn't mean a problem-free system. It just means it hasn't been tested yet. When everything is predictable, you feel safe. But when a small variable appears, you finally see what's underneath. And if that structure is too tight, too many fixed commitments, not enough breathing room, then even a small change can create pressure. And here's the key point. That pressure doesn't come from big numbers. It comes from the feeling of losing control. You start thinking more, calculating more, hesitating more, not because you're incapable, but because your system has no room left to breathe. And that's when you realize the problem isn't this month. It's how everything was built before. The takeaway: you don't feel pressure when things are running. You feel it when your system can't handle small changes anymore. Main idea 3. What exhausts you isn't a lack of money. It's having to think about money all the time. I've realized something very subtle, but incredibly important. Two people can earn the same, spend the same, even have the same amount left each month, but their internal experience can feel completely different. One feels mentally light. The other feels constantly calculating. And what's interesting is the difference isn't in the numbers. It's in how often they have to think about money. You can see this in small moments. Before buying something, you're not just thinking, should I buy this? You start replaying everything in your head. What you've already spent, what bills are coming up, what might get charged automatically. A small decision, but it triggers a chain reaction of thoughts. And what drains you isn't the purchase. It's the mental process behind it. Most people don't realize when your financial system becomes complex, you don't just lose money, you lose clarity. Money no longer feels like a simple flow. It becomes something you have to constantly manage. And when you have to manage it all the time, your mind never fully rests. That's why some people don't spend that much, yet still feel exhausted by money. Not because they're lacking, but because they're thinking too much just to stay afloat. Meanwhile, others don't necessarily earn more, but their system is simpler, fewer things to track, fewer decisions to weigh, and as a result, they feel lighter, not because they're smarter, but because they're carrying less mentally, which leads to a truth not many people say clearly. Financial freedom isn't when you never think about money. It's when you don't have to think about it all the time. The takeaway: what drains you isn't earning or spending. It's having to carry money in your mind too often. Main idea 4. You don't lose money because of bad decisions. You lose it because of good decisions. That never stop. I've realized something that's really hard to see if you only look at decisions one by one. Most of what you're spending on isn't wrong. In fact, it makes sense. Something that makes your life more convenient. Something that saves you time. Something that makes you feel better day to day. Each one has a reason. And that's exactly the problem. What's interesting is people don't usually get into trouble with obviously bad decisions. We tend to avoid those, but we're very likely to drift through decisions that are just slightly right. A simple example: you add something to your life, and it genuinely improves things. You don't feel pressure. You feel like it's worth it. Later, you add something else, also reasonable, also not too big, and it keeps going. There's never a moment where you think, I've gone too far. There's no clear stopping point, no warning signal, just a series of small decisions, each one feeling fine on its own. Most people don't realize financial pressure doesn't come from one bad decision. It comes from having no stopping point. You never pause to look at the whole picture, never stop to ask, if I keep all of this, what does my system actually become? And when you don't ask that question, the system grows on its own, not in a way you control, but in the way your decisions accumulate. At some point, you don't even remember where it started. You just know this. Everything makes sense, but together, it feels heavy. That's a very specific kind of pressure. Nothing is clearly wrong, but nothing feels light either. And because there's no obvious mistake, you don't even know what to fix. The takeaway: you don't lose money because of bad decisions. You lose control because you never knew when to stop. Main idea 5. What makes you feel off isn't the amount of money. It's not knowing where you stand. I've realized something people rarely say clearly. Financial anxiety doesn't come from having too little or too much. It comes from not knowing where you are. You don't really know your position in your own financial picture. It sounds strange, but pay attention. There are phases where you're not lacking money at all. You can still spend, still maintain your life, but inside, there's this vague feeling. Am I actually okay? Am I moving forward or just standing still? If something happens, what would I do? What's interesting is these questions don't show up when you're broke. They show up when you don't understand how your money is actually working. Most people don't realize they know how much they earn. They know what they spend, but they don't know. After everything, is their system getting stronger or weaker? A simple example: you might be saving a bit each month, while also slowly increasing long-term commitments. You might not be spending more, but you're becoming more dependent on your income. You might feel fine, but your buffer is actually shrinking. And because you can't see the full picture, your mind creates a very specific feeling: uncertainty. Not panic, not obvious fear, just a kind of in-between state where you don't know where you're heading. That's why some people earn more than before, but don't feel more secure, not because money isn't enough, but because they can't clearly see their system. When you can't see, you can't trust. And when there's no trust, every decision feels heavier. You hesitate more, you double-check more, you overthink more, not because you're weak, but because you're trying to find something you can't clearly see. The takeaway: that off feeling doesn't come from lacking money. It comes from not knowing where you stand in your own system. Main idea 6. You don't actually lose control of your finances. You lose the ability to choose without trade-offs. I've realized something really important, but rarely said out loud. Most people think they lose financial control when they run out of money, but what's interesting is that feeling shows up much earlier. It shows up when every choice starts to come with a trade-off. You want to buy something. You're not thinking, should I buy this? You're thinking, if I buy this, what do I have to give up? You want to take a break, but your mind goes, if I rest, will this affect my month? You want to try something new, but immediately you think, if it doesn't work, can I handle it? Most people don't realize this is no longer about money. It's about your space to choose. When your system still has room, you can make decisions without stress. You can be a little wrong, try things, adjust. But when your system tightens, every decision has a cost. Not just financial cost, but the cost of trade-offs. And when every choice has a price, you start limiting yourself. You play it safe. You try less. You delay more. Not because you don't want to, but because you don't have enough room to take risks. That's when people say, I've lost control of my finances. But in reality, they haven't. They're still paying everything, still maintaining the system. Only one thing has changed. They no longer feel free when making decisions. And that's the most subtle form of losing control. It's quiet, hard to see, but it makes you live more cautiously than necessary. The takeaway: you don't lose control when you run out of money. You lose it when every choice becomes a trade-off. Main idea 7. You don't need to earn more to feel lighter. You need fewer things you have to maintain. I've realized something a lot of people get backwards. When financial pressure shows up, our natural reaction is, I need to earn more. That sounds logical, and sometimes it's true. But what's interesting is, a lot of people earn more and feel exactly the same, sometimes even heavier. Why? Because when income increases, many people don't reduce pressure. They just upgrade their system. More options, more convenience, more things that feel deserved, and at the same time, more things to maintain. Most people don't realize higher income doesn't automatically create relief. It just gives you the opportunity to redesign your life. And if you unconsciously design it with more obligations, then no matter how much you earn, you'll still feel stuck. A simple example: you no longer worry about small expenses, but now you have bigger, longer-term ones. Before, you had flexibility. Now, you have to maintain. Before, you could adjust easily. Now, everything needs to stay stable. So what happens? You trade one kind of pressure for another, just more subtle, harder to notice. And because you're doing better, you feel like you shouldn't feel stressed. But that internal feeling doesn't lie. It's still there, not because you lack money, but because you're carrying too much. Which leads to an important truth. Financial relief doesn't come from having more. It comes from needing less. Not less in a minimalist sense, but fewer unnecessary obligations, so your system can breathe again. The takeaway: you don't need to earn more to feel lighter. You need fewer things you're forced to maintain. I've realized most people don't actually have a money problem. They have a system problem. No decision was too wrong. No mistake was too big. Just a series of small choices, quietly accepted over time. And eventually, those choices create a system that you now have to serve. What's interesting is, you don't notice this while things are still working. You only feel it when the system starts to tighten, when you think more, when you trade off more, when you're no longer sure where you stand. And that's when you finally ask, why does money feel so exhausting? But the answer isn't in the present. It's in how everything was built before. So maybe what you need isn't a new financial plan. It's a new perspective. Look at what you're maintaining. Look at what you've agreed to. And most importantly, ask yourself whether your system still gives you choices or just keeps you stable. Once you see that clearly, your decisions start to feel lighter. If you see yourself in this, you don't need to change everything overnight. Just start by recognizing where you are. And if you want to better understand how money really shapes your thinking and behavior, consider subscribing. Because sometimes, seeing the problem clearly is where everything starts to change.